Hi everyone and welcome to Fresh from My Garden. In today's video, I'm sharing some newly added plant collections, some of which have been purchased from nurseries and some of which we have got from family and friends. So, when we are taking cuttings of plants from our friends or family's garden and bringing them home, there are so many plants that we lose even before they are repotted. So, in today's video, I am sharing tips on how to keep these plants fresh until they are repotted in a new container or in our garden, and also a few tips on how to take these cuttings and prevent fungal attack on these cuttings. So keep watching. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, we have a few plants that we purchased from a couple of nurseries, and in addition to that, we have some plants that we got from few friends and family. So, when we are taking cuttings or saplings from our friends or family members' gardens, there are a few things that we need to keep in mind so that these plants remain fresh until they are repotted or transplanted into a new container. Every time I visit my hometown, I always get some cuttings of plants or tiny saplings that I take from my parents' garden, and mostly they are bare rooted, like the one you see here. But if there is a delay in repotting them into a new container, sometimes these plants show signs of dying back or withering, and sometimes they don't really grow well. So there are a few things that we can take care so that these plants will remain fresh for a few days until they are repotted into a new container in their new home. When we get a bare rooted plant from somebody's garden, and until we plant it in our garden or in a new container, we can place it in one container that already has plants in it. When the soil is moist, this root will not dry up completely and it will stay fresh for a few days. So, in our new plant collection, we have some Calatheas that we got at a really good price. So, we got few varieties of Calatheas, and here are the Begonias that I collected from my grandmother's garden. So, as you can see, she has a lot of varieties of begonias. We found an empty pot in her garden, so we placed a lot of these plants into that container. Now, this is a bare root plant, which is, I think, a variety of caladium. I'm not really sure. So, this didn't have enough space in that pot, so we just placed it on moist soil and covered it with a paper towel that is has been wet with some water. So this will stay moist for a few days. So all these plants were picked yesterday evening, and it's almost 24 hours since we picked all these plants, but they are still looking fresh because one is that the weather now is cooler and moist and there are rains, so these plants will stay fresh for a longer period of time. And we also placed it into a temporary container with some soil and topped the roots of this plant with more moist soil so that it doesn't dry out until it is repotted. So it will stay like this for a few days, but we cannot keep it like this permanently for a long time. It definitely needs to be repotted into individual containers at least in the next week. So these collections are something that I've been wanting for quite some time. So I've got quite a few collections of begonia from my grandmother's garden. And until they are repotted into new containers, they are in this temporary container, and it will remain fresh as long as we keep the soil moist and away from too much of direct sunlight. Now here we have a cutting of syngonium that we got from a friend's place, and this we have placed it in a plastic tub or a takeout container with a moist cloth wrapped around its roots. So this will help this plant not dry out or die completely. So you can see that these plants were all taken more than a day back and they are all continuing to remain fresh. And the reason for it is the moisture that is being maintained, and it should also not be kept in any sort of direct sunlight once it has been pulled out of the soil or once it has been transplanted. So, that is one thing to keep in mind whenever we get new plants for our garden, and once they are repotted or once you have taken cuttings of them, make sure you don't keep it in a spot that gets too much of direct sunlight, because the cuttings or the new saplings will not be able to withstand that harsh sunlight immediately after it has been removed from the container in which it was growing. Now, here we have some lilies that are growing in my parents' garden, and I am taking a few bulbs from the container in which it was growing. And these bulbs will remain fresh for a longer period of time. And this is the Heliconia plant, which also grows from rhizomes. And flowering plants that grow from rhizomes or from bulbs remain fresh for a few days even after they are pulled out of the soil. So, with these heliconias, we have uprooted these plants from the soil. So, these rhizomes were uprooted from the soil, and we are placing that on a moist newspaper, or you can place them on a paper towel that is moist, and wrap up the roots with that moist paper. So that will help it stay fresh for a few days until it is repotted into a new container or into the soil. Just make sure that the cloth or paper that you're using to wrap up the roots of these plants don't remain too wet and they are just moist. So, remaining too wet or soaking wet will cause root rot or some fungal problems. And also take care to transplant or repot these plants as soon as possible and not let them remain in this condition for too long. So now here I have some Mexican petunia and also some epicea cuttings that we got from my cousin's house, and we have placed all of this over the last day in this moist newspaper and they continue to remain fresh. So keep them in a spot away from direct sunlight. Keep them wrapped up, keep the roots wrapped up in some moist paper or moist cloth so that they can remain fresh for a few days before repotting. So, these are some of the tips that we can use to keep these plants fresh until we repot them into a new container. So, every time we come to our hometown, we get some cuttings or saplings from our family and from our cousins' gardens. But many times, by the time I am back home and by the time I get the time to repot these plants, several of them would have died or withered completely, and there would be no hope of getting them back to life again. So this time, this is something that I'm giving a try, and after more than 24 hours, I'm seeing that these plants are still fresh and they are looking good, and hopefully they will stay like this for a couple more days till I have time to plant them in a new container. So I've seen a lot of plant hunt videos and a lot of foraging videos where, you know, a lot of people collect plants from different places to bring home to their own garden. But many times these foraged plants or these plants that we pull out from different places, they don't survive very well once they are brought back into our garden. Some of them do, some of them don't. So, these are a few tips that I wanted to share today so that these plants that we collect from different places to add to our garden does well in our garden too. So, looking at the plant collections that we have got from the nursery, we have this is the bamboo orchid. We saw that this bamboo has a beautiful flower growing on it, so we got this bamboo orchid. And this is a plant from my grandmother's garden. She had many of this growing in her garden. I'm not sure of the name of this flower, but since it looked really pretty, we got one and immediately potted it into a small container temporarily. And another thing that we need to keep in mind when we are getting new plants like these is we need to know care tips of these plants, whether we are getting it from the nursery or from a friend's garden. Just make sure to gather some knowledge about the plant so that once they are in our garden, they continue to thrive and grow well as they have been in other places. So there are a few plants like the Calatheas that don't prefer direct sunlight. They want to be in shade and in humid spots. And there are other plants that prefer direct sunlight, like many of the flowering plants. This is the ground orchid plant that we see a lot in our hometown. Many gardens have these plants, and I have a couple of colors of these, so I wanted to collect one color that I don't have. Torania is another plant that does well in full sunlight and gives us a lot of flowers. So, just like that, make sure to learn tips about the new plants that we are collecting, because many plants that we see does well in many gardens or in our friend's place or in the nursery, but once we bring it home, if the conditions are not right, if it doesn't get the right amount of sunlight or the right amount of shade or watering, then these plants can die back, and it's not very nice to see the plants that we have collected with so much of love and passion dying back and not surviving in our garden. Now, these are some of the plants that we are planning to add to our garden. So, I really would like to collect some more. There are some canna lilies and rain lilies in my parents' garden, which also I will be collecting. So, those are also grown from bulbs. So, we can just uproot the bulbs and store them in the newspaper until they are ready to be planted. In addition to those plants, we have a couple of monstera varieties in my parents' garden. So they are growing in containers and they are growing pretty well. So I've taken a few cuttings of these. Many times, when we take cuttings of plants, we sometimes see a black fungal growth at the tip where the cutting has been taken, and sometimes those cuttings or plants don't survive. So, what I have done here is smeared a little bit of pseudomonas at the tip of the cutting that I have taken, and also at the tip of the plant from where the cutting was taken. So, whenever you're taking any cuttings of plants, make sure that the knife or the cutter which you're using has been sterilized so that there is no bacterial or any sort of fungal infection that infects the plant or the cutting. And once this cutting has been taken, you can add some sort of fungicide. Here I have used Pseudomonas as a fungicide to cover up that spot so that there is no fungal attack on the rest of the plant or on the cutting that we are taking. I hope you liked today's video and the tips that I shared for collecting new plants for your garden. With just a little bit of care, we can have a lot of different varieties of plants that thrive well in our indoor and outdoor garden. So, If you do like this video, please give it a thumbs up and also subscribe to our channel for more gardening related videos. Thanks for watching Fresh from my garden.